This is part 41 in our series Wild Harvest Edibles. Thou preparest a table before me. And just a reminder that as you navigate any health challenge, it's always recommended that you partner with a medical practitioner that shares your philosophy of care and wellness of the human body, both in health and in disease. And the information that I share here this evening is from an educational standpoint, just something that you can improve your wellness toolbox with and aid you in returning to health if sick and maintaining good health if you're well. It shouldn't be considered medical advice and just simply as tools. And always do your own due diligence on anything that sounds like it might be something you'd like to try, any treatment or protocol or procedure, before just taking for granted what any one person should say about it. Thomas Edison said many years ago that the doctor of the future will give no medicine, but will instruct his patient in the care of the human frame, in diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease. Very appropriate, apropos, timely counsel back in his day, and even around that time and earlier in 1885 in Counsels in Diet and Health, in Testimonies for the Church 5, Ellen White shared with us that there are many ways of practicing the healing art, but there's only one way that heaven approves. God's remedies are the simple agencies of nature that will not tax or debilitate the system through their powerful properties. Pure air and water, cleanliness, a proper diet and purity of life, and a firm trust in God are remedies for the want of which thousands are dying. Yet these remedies are going out of date because their skillful use requires work that the people do not appreciate. Fresh air, exercise, pure water, and clean, sweet premises are within the reach of all, with but little expense. But drugs are expensive, both in the outlay of means and the effect produced upon the system. And both of those things are very true. And there's also a dichotomy that we see in our current day and age between useful, helpful, effective, safe, off-patent medications as compared to novel, new, toxic drugs with purported positive effects that haven't been tested long enough to know if they're safe. So they're expensive both in their cost physically as well as numerically. In 3 John 1 verse 2, it stated, "Beloved, I pray that you prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers." In Romans 12:2, we're admonished that presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice to God with his mercies is our reasonable sacrifice. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We're also told that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. But he did provide for us many different modalities and ways to address the things that have come upon us in this world. So the thing I want to start focusing on this evening is club moss, Lycopodium clavatum. It's also known as staghorn, ground pine, or running pine. It's a native actually all across the world. It's found worldwide. And it's also found here in the Northwest. It's a vascular spore-bearing plant. What vascular means is it has xylem and phloem, which is the blood of plants flowing through little vessels in the moss, just like we have in larger flower-bearing plants. Things that are non-vascular are things like algae. Algae is avascular because it absorbs all its nutrients directly across the water cell barrier because there's no air interfering with it. It propagates using spores. Spores are hard, resilient structures that can survive some time in between their germinating, so to speak, and when they're released. It's not a true moss. It's more akin to the horsetails and ferns in many respects. Again, it's found around the world, and looking at it from an identification standpoint, it has scale-like yellow to green leaves, and it tapers to a fine end point, kind of like a pine tree, like a Douglas fir, for example, has that same kind of morphology or shape. It can have 3 to 4 foot long, highly branched spiral presentation. So the little leaves that come off the little kind of pine needle-like shaped branches that come off spiral along the main stem. It hugs the ground. It doesn't grow upright. It's a ground hugging plant, moss, and it has roots along its stem at frequent intervals. The spores present themselves on 2 to 3 inch barrel shaped cones on stalks. So you can see those spore presenting cones there in the bottom right and bottom left pictures. So they're pretty decent sized, and there's quite a few of them in a mature kind of stand of club moss. And below is a pile, in the center there is a pile of the spores. So it's not considered edible, but it has a large medicinal role. The parts that are used are primarily spores. Again, a pile of spores here on the right, and those we'll talk about how to collect those later along here, and also whole plant extract. So we'll talk about how to make a decoction so you can extract the medicinal qualities of the club moss. So on the lower right, you can see some club moss spores. So those are a scanning electron microscope that's taken those pictures. The little bracket there is 10 micrometers across. So that gives you an idea of what the size is, a 10 micrometer range. So just to give you a perspective, I believe there's 10 micrometers in a millimeter, or yes, a millimeter, and there's 10 millimeters per centimeter. So respiratory issues is one of the ways that it's beneficial. So make a decoction of the club moss spores, and it's helpful for chronic lung disorders, bronchial disorders, and other respiratory issues, especially where there's mucus involved. Now we can see that kind of delineated a little bit more here when we talk about congestive aspects of flu and colds. So again, the spores of the club moss dry out the mucous membranes, and that can be taken, as we'll see here, in an aqueous solution in water. It helps to relieve congestion. So you make a drink of the spores. So you can purchase these spores. I found them online at various different vendors, but you would take a 1/4 teaspoon of the spores, mix them in a glass of water, and then you can drink them 3 times a day until the congestion itself resolves. So it helps to break down that mucus and allow it to be expelled more readily. Mucus is basically one way the body responds to allergens or bacterial presentations in an attempt to muck it up and prevent its spread. But in the same process or the same time, mucus ends up clogging airways, making it hard to breathe. And so while it's doing its job, it can do it so well that it causes a problem. So being able to expectorate or get it out, break it up and get it out of the body is an important process. So you're not actually discouraging your body's ability to produce mucus, you're just enabling your body to expel it effectively, thereby not killing itself off in the process of mucus production. So it's a beneficial tool to be able to have an expectorant or a mucus breakdown strategy when mucus is produced. Other things like milk actually are fairly, in a way, they're alert allergens because they're very mucus producing. Milk is very mucus producing, and all milk derivatives are mucus producing. So staying away from dairy products is very helpful in reducing mucus load. It's helpful in urinary tract issues, so it functions actually in a diuretic role. It helps increase urine output, and by increasing urine output, it also aids in the flushing of any toxins that may be there, creating the irritation and the infection, including the bacteria that may be there causing issues. So to do that, you would use a whole plant decoction. We've mentioned decoction a couple different times here already, but this is how you would make that decoction. Place the crushed or ground fresh or dried club moss into a pot and soak it in cold water for several hours. So that begins the extraction process, the soaking. Then cover the pot and bring it to a slow boil. So just put it on medium heat, bring it up to a boil. And then once it's boiling, you want to pay attention because you don't want to boil it for a prolonged period of time, but you do want to simmer it. So reduce the heat and let it simmer until the volume has reduced, so it's evaporated away by half. So that's approximately 15 to 20 minutes of time. Once that's happened, if it boils away more rapidly than that, give it some more fluid, but you want to have it extract about that amount of time, 15 to 20 minutes. And that's going to depend a little bit on your altitude and other factors that may affect the boiling time of your decoction. Then strain out the parts of the club moss. Cheesecloth is a great way to do that. Put it over a pot and then squeeze the liquid out of the herbs as well, so you get the most juice you can from them, because that's what you're having. The good medicinal properties are going to be in that juice. And then pour that fluid extraction known as the decoction into a jar. And in this case, you want to use it within 48 hours, just as the straight decoction, or you can freeze it for future use. So if you have, some things are seasonal, you may be able to make a decoction and then freeze it. Unlike a tincture you're going to make either in vegetable glycerin or alcohol, that has a shelf life, and that will last for much longer on the shelf. A decoction is something that you want to use within a timely period of time. Like a tea, you're going to make a tea and drink immediately, but a decoction, you're going to have a little bit longer period of time to use it, and it's stronger than a tea. So it has a higher medicinal purpose there. So in general, a decoction is 4 times the medicinal properties as the same thing used as a tea. So it has much more potency to it than just an herbal tea. So in a healthy adult, 1 cup 3 times per day is a good amount to utilize. And then based on the child's weight, if it's a heavy child, about an adult weight, then you can use an adult ratio. But for children, about ½ a cup 3 times per day would be a good way to administer that. Other issues that are helpful in conjunction with the skin, we have allergic reactions, various burns that can have skin presentation, psoriasis, eczema, fungal infections of the skin, chickenpox. So those would be the pox themselves. The contact dermatitis that can occur from some things, hives, which essentially is a very small rash that has bumps associated with it, maybe itchy. Insect bites and stings can all benefit from salves made of club moss. So to make a club moss salve, you're going to be utilizing the spores. And on the right side, you'll see the recipe for making a salve. Basically, you'll combine the herbs and your carrier oil. So that'd be olive oil or coconut oil or some other carrier oil. Remember that coconut oil will become hard upon cooling. Could almost function as a salve in that regard, unlike something like a fractionated coconut oil, which is going to maintain its liquidity at room temperature. So use a double boiler. Make sure you have water in the bottom so you don't boil it dry, of course, and then cover the herbs with the oil in the top part of your double boiler. So simmer at 100 degrees for several hours. So you're simmering the oil. You're not boiling it because you don't want to boil the oil, because that's going to make it break down. But you want it to aid that extraction process. Stir it, cool it a bit, and then strain it. Now you're going to put that liquid back into the double boiler, and then you're going to add beeswax. Shaved beeswax or beeswax flakes is an easy way to do that. 1/4 cup of wax to 1/5 of a cup of oil. And then you can add some essential oils if you'd like for various additional therapeutic properties, or you can leave them out. Often vitamin E is added at a 1/2 teaspoon to 16-ounce quantity to protect the oil from rancidity. And then you may not have the exact consistency that you're going to want at the end of your creation process. So you can add a little bit more of your beeswax to make it thicker. But again, it's going to cool and come to a consistency. So you may want to do a trial cooling and see if it's the way you want it. And that'll come with time, knowing the proper way, proper ratios to do, and come with as you learn how to do it more efficiently. So then, of course, label, date, and store whatever you make so you know what it is. The spores can also be applied in their powder form to wounds in skin folds that may be irritated, kind of like a talcum powder, only a talcum powder is not going to have therapeutic properties associated with it, mainly just reducing friction and maybe having some drying effects. But the spores are going to be helpful in aiding the healing. They can help to speed the healing and absorb moisture in a similar fashion that you might think of talcum powder doing in that regard. So anywhere surface oil isn't wanted in a particular place, you can add the spores of the club moss. It's also helpful for rheumatoid arthritis. So another whole plant decoction can help to relieve the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. So rheumatoid arthritis kind of comes and goes, not particularly predictable, but it can help to mitigate those symptoms. Intestinal gas, actually, here's a great way to help if you're dealing with carbohydrates or other sources of intestinal gas, so bad gas and constipation both can benefit from the use of club moss spores. Just take up to as little as a quarter teaspoon in water can help to resolve gas pains and flatulence. Again, you can see the microscopic structure of the spores. And if you were to look at charcoal, activated charcoal, it would also have all those little cavities. Diatoms are similar in that regard. All those little tiny cavities are effective at picking up any toxins or other agents that may be not beneficial and carry them out of the system. The upper picture is a cross-section of the cone of the club moss, and you can see that the larger portion of it is the cone part, and then where the arrow points into the spores, they're inside of, packed inside that sporangium. The sporangium is the capsule that's inside there, and all the spores are inside of that. So kidney disease, again, remember that it functions as a diuretic, so that's a good thing. That's kidneys are part of the urinary system. So whole plant decoction, again, is useful for that. Again, it's going to have that diuretic component to it. It can also aid the kidney in eliminating stones and cleansing it. So a good kidney cleanse and a stone mitigator, either as a preventative and or a treatment potential. And then just generally in wounds, again, the club moss spores in the powder form. So here's a powder pile down here in the lower right for open wounds or sores that resist healing. They can kind of get weepy and just really kind of nasty. This can help in those types of tough to heal wound situations. So just rub the spores into the area that's affected. Harvesting. So if you're harvesting the green part, you can just clip it off and save it. If you're actually attempting to get the spores, you could clip off the spores themselves, and best harvested when they're dry and mature, completely ripe, but haven't released their spores yet. So if you can get them right at the right stage, just cut off those sporangia, that's those tall staghorn appearing pieces in the upper right corner there. You can put them on a sheet or a tarp, allow the cones to dry and then release their spores. And then you can just shake it together and collect all the spores from the sheet. An alternative way to do that, if you had green cones, if you caught them when they weren't completely dry, just cut them and put them in a paper bag, put them in a place where it's dry, and wait for them to dry out and mature, and then they'll release those spores inside. Just shake the bag vigorously, and that'll release the spores into the bag. Then you can just discard and remove, shake out the plant parts, the rest of the moss parts, and you'll have your spores left in the bottom of the bag. Something to keep in mind is that club moss contains trace quantities of alkaloids. You don't want to consume any of it in high quantity because it can have paralysis effects on motor nerves if used in large quantities. So use it medicinally, not as a primary food item. So use it judiciously, but it can have some very beneficial effects and benefits. So here's a salve that's specific to the spores. Here's a double boiler, if you're not familiar with that. There's also steamers. This is a whole pot in top of a pot. A steamer would have holes in the bottom and is a great way to steam various veggies rather than boiling them. So you're going to be using the double boiler, the whole pot, kind of double pot formation. So 5 ounces of organic olive oil or other carrier oil also would work well. An ounce of shaved beeswax and 1 tablespoon of club moss spore powder. So this is making a spore specific salve. So gently warm the oil in a double boiler, add the club moss spore powder, and keep it on low heat for 20 to 30 minutes. Again, you don't want to boil it. Add the shaved beeswax, stir it in until it's well mixed up and all thoroughly mixed together. Don't strain out the spores. So in a whole plant extraction or salve, you would strain out the solid portions, but not the spores in this case. Then pour that salve into sanitized jars. You can simply sanitize jars by turning them upside down in a pot of boiling water, and that sanitizes jars very well. It's a common way of doing it for canning. Cover it tightly and then refrigerate it if you're in a hot climate, because it will solidify. If you're too hot a climate, it'll stay more fluid in nature. And then as needed, you can apply it on the skin 2 to 3 times a day. Our next plant is Coltsfoot, Tussilago farfara. So it's also known as coughwort, podbell, sun before the father. Some very interesting common names. One of the important things to remember is looking at things from their scientific name, just to make sure that you have the specific thing, because in different locales, the common name could be different from what you expect it to be. The idea of scientific naming is that it gives consistency across cultures and localities for the same plant. It's a member of the aster plant, or aster family, and daisy family. It's related to the butterbird, and it's actually a European plant that's been naturalized to North America, both Canada and the United States. The flowers look like dandelions, but they appear in early spring, April, before the leaves appear. So they'll come up like a dandelion, but have no dandelion component to them. They actually have a bit of an underground rhizome effect, so they do tend to spread. The plant grows from 4 to 6 inches in height, and typically in areas with disturbed soil. It has similar characteristics to dandelion. Down in the middle picture there, you can see how it gets a kind of a poofy top, just like a dandelion would. But it has 2 separate plants there. It has the flowering plant, and then it has the leaves. You can see the leaves to the right, the lower right. The leaf top is smooth. The bottom has very fine downy hairs on it. And the upper leaf is green. The bottom is kind of a grayish color. And specifically higher leaves and lower leaves closer to the ground. 2 to 10 inches long and slightly serrated. You can see those serrated edges along the edge. And again, it flowers before the leaves appear. The flowers will be gone typically by the time its leaves show itself. So this is one plant where you would note its presence from its flower and then be able to come back later, remembering where it was, labeling it somehow perhaps, and then be able to utilize the leaves at a separate time. The leaves are edible. In small quantity, they can be used in salads. This is a bitter, so like dandelion is a bitter, and there are benefits to including bitters in small quantities into your diet. Quinine is a bitter, dandelion is a bitter. There are other types of bitters. So you don't want to use too much of it, although the toxicity is destroyed upon cooking. So you can eat the raw leaves in a sparing fashion, but the cooked leaves, if you're going to cook them, drain them, and then rinse them before use, so you don't retain any of the leftover boiled out toxins. So you can use the fresh or dried leaves and the fresh or dried flowers to make an aromatic tea. From a medicinal standpoint, the flowers contain the highest concentration of medicinal compounds. The roots, although they're not typically used, also have medicinal compounds. They're anti-inflammatory and anti-tussive. So tussive means coughing. So you may be familiar with something like Robitussin. So it's a robust anti-coughing agent, essentially. So it's a trade name that's been coined using tussive or coughing as its name. The key components are mucilage, mucilagens, and tannins that are present in the flowers. So everything to do with coughing is benefited by Coltsfoot. So asthma, bronchial congestion. So Tussilago, which is its genus name, means cough dispeller. And that's how it was named. So scientific names aren't just for show. Sometimes they are vain. They're named after the person who found them, but many times they actually have a descriptive property about them. In this case, it's its medicinal quality that is being described here. It works very well at helping coughs to be less annoying. It relieves congestion and expels mucus. So we just talked about that same mucus expelling component with our previous discussion, as well with the club moss. So it's very excellent for persistent coughs, particularly in things like emphysema or whooping cough. So a decoction used through the day is helpful for all different types of chronic coughing situations. So a Coltsfoot decoction, you would take 1 ounce of Coltsfoot leaves. This is presumably dry leaves, and a quart of water. Raw honey is an optional additive because it is a bitter, as we mentioned earlier. Combine those leaves and water and bring it to a boil on medium. So a slow, gradual warming process. So you're going to have the longest extraction of the medicinal properties as you're able. And then reduce the heat and simmer until the liquid is reduced to half. That's a typical decoction process. Cool it and strain it, sweeten it with honey. It's an optional aspect because it can be very bitter. The older the leaves, the more bitter it's going to be. And it's a good question that I just thought of, whether or not the medicinal properties are more or less with age. Potentially it has a higher concentration of medicinal components with age, in that it's the most bitter at that time. So drink a quarter cup through the day as a relief for a cough. So for skin issues, the Coltsfoot flowers can be used as a poultice directly. And you could probably dry those as well and keep them for a rehydrated poultice if necessary. If you didn't have something else on hand, there's lots of other things that can be used for poultices for skin issues, like plantain, for example, that's going to be around all season long. But you could also dry some for use at a later date. So directly apply that to the skin inflammation. So in Washington State, it turns out that Coltsfoot is considered a noxious weed. It actually has some underground rhizomes that allow it to spread some. And there was indication that it tends to crop up in places where another weed, I think it's Polygonum, has been attempted to be eradicated, which I think is another noxious weed. So within Washington State, it's something that you may want to know where it is. If you're going to cultivate it carefully, but you wouldn't want to escape because it has a noxious weed status as of 2018 in Washington State. It may be different in other parts of the country. Again, if you'd like to go back and look at this again, preparingforthediamondtrouble.com has an archive of this presentation and others, as well as past and future presentations.